The radar images didn't make sense. In 2016, scientists studying climate change in Greenland were using specialized ground-penetrating radar to monitor how the Arctic ice was melting. The technology was supposed to show them simple things: ice thickness, water layers, thermal patterns. But the radar was showing them something else entirely, something geometric, something that didn't belong in nature, something that looked manufactured. The scientists stared at the radar screens in confusion. Buried 40 meters beneath the Greenlandic ice sheet, perfectly preserved, was a massive structure. Not a mountain, not a natural formation. A structure, tunnels, buildings, an entire underground complex frozen in time, hidden beneath ice for decades, waiting to be discovered. What they were looking at wasn't just a geological anomaly, it was a secret. A secret that the United States military had buried beneath tons of Arctic ice. A secret that had been forgotten, lost, abandoned decades ago. A secret that was now emerging as the planet warmed and the ice began to retreat. The scientists immediately contacted military officials. The military officials immediately went into crisis mode, because what was buried beneath that ice was one of the most classified military operations of the Cold War. A base so secret that even most Americans didn't know it existed. A base that had been designed to house nuclear weapons within striking distance of the Soviet Union. A base that had been built in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. This is the story of Camp Century. This is the story of the Arctic's most dangerous secret. This is the story of an American military installation that time forgot and climate change would not allow to remain forgotten. To understand why America would build a secret military base beneath Arctic ice, you have to understand the paranoia of the 1950s. The United States had just fought a war against the Soviet Union's allies. The Soviet Union now possessed atomic weapons. The two superpowers stood at the brink of nuclear annihilation. And between them lay a chasm of fear, distrust, and existential dread that shaped every decision made by military leadership on both sides. American strategists looked at a map of the world and saw a nightmare. The Soviet Union was vast, sprawling across 11 time zones. But it was also distant. American bombers flying from bases in Europe or Asia would need to fly thousands of miles to reach Soviet cities. That meant Soviet air defenses would have time to respond. That meant American bombers could be shot down. That meant the American nuclear deterrent, which depended on the ability to guarantee a second strike against Soviet targets, was potentially compromised. The solution seemed obvious to military planners. If you could station atomic weapons closer to the Soviet Union, you could reduce the flight time for American bombers. You could increase the probability of getting through Soviet defenses. You could guarantee that even if the Soviets launched a first strike against America, American weapons would still reach Soviet targets. But where could you place these weapons? Every obvious location had a problem. Bases in Western Europe were visible to Soviet satellites and Soviet spies. Bases in Turkey or Iran were politically controversial and vulnerable to overthrow by hostile governments. Bases in Japan or Guam were too far away. Military planners looked at a map and saw one location that seemed perfect: Greenland. Greenland was a Danish territory, but it was strategically important. It sat directly between North America and the Soviet Union. It was positioned perfectly to allow American bombers to reach Soviet targets quickly. And most importantly, it was largely uninhabited. It was frozen. It was remote. It was the perfect place to hide a secret. American military strategists proposed a plan. They would construct a base in Greenland. But not a conventional base. Not a base visible from above. A base that would be hidden beneath the Arctic ice. A base that Soviet satellites could never see. A base that would house atomic weapons and serve as a staging point for American bombers. The base would be called Camp Century. The plan was approved. The military drew up blueprints. Engineers began working on designs that had never been attempted before. How do you build a city beneath ice? How do you keep it warm? How do you keep it supplied? How do you hide it from satellites? How do you build something that will last decades in an environment that actively tries to destroy everything humans create? In 1959, the first American military transport planes landed on an ice airstrip in northern Greenland. They carried bulldozers and excavation equipment. They carried construction workers and engineers. They carried supplies for what would become one of the most ambitious military construction projects of the Cold War. The plan was audacious beyond belief. American engineers would dig down through the ice to a depth of about 150 feet. At that depth, they would begin carving out a network of tunnels. In those tunnels, they would build barracks, laboratories, power plants, storage facilities, and weapons vaults. They would create an underground city beneath the ice that could house nuclear weapons and the personnel required to maintain them. The first challenge was simply moving through the ice. Ice is not soft. Ice does not yield easily to human effort. Engineers had to use specialized equipment. Thermal borers designed to melt ice rather than cut it. Excavators that could move slowly through frozen ground. They had to develop new techniques because nothing like this had ever been attempted at this scale before. The second challenge was structure. Ice at 150 feet depth is under tremendous pressure from the weight of ice above. The deeper you tunnel, the more the ice wants to collapse inward. The engineers designed the tunnels to be semicircular in cross-section, allowing the ice to naturally distribute the load. They didn't use conventional walls. They used the ice itself as the walls, relying on the structural properties of ice to prevent collapse. The third challenge was temperature control. Even at 150 feet beneath the surface, where the ice was initially warmer than the surface, the temperature was still brutally cold. If you brought electronic equipment into this environment, the cold would destroy it. If you built structures that generated heat, that heat would melt the ice and create instability. The solution was to maintain the base at a carefully calculated temperature that was cold enough to prevent ice melt, but warm enough to allow people to work and equipment to function. American engineers solved this problem by installing heating systems that maintained the temperature at about -10 degrees Celsius. It was cold enough that humans had to wear insulated clothing constantly. It was cold enough that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. But it was warm enough that equipment could function and structures could remain stable. The construction proceeded with stunning efficiency. By 1960, the basic tunnel system had been excavated. By 1961, the barracks had been built. By 1962, the first atomic weapons were being stored in specially constructed vaults beneath the Arctic ice. Camp Century had become operational. The base was small by military standards, but the infrastructure was extraordinary. There were housing units that could accommodate up to 200 personnel. There were dining facilities, recreational areas, laboratories, and weapon storage vaults. There were power plants that generated electricity from diesel generators. There were water systems that produced fresh water from melted ice. There was a hospital. There was a chapel. There was even a small library and a theater. Most importantly, there were weapons storage vaults. Multiple redundant vaults designed to withstand nuclear explosion. Vaults that could store dozens of nuclear warheads. Vaults that could keep the weapons at the perfect temperature and humidity to maintain their functionality. Vaults that represented American military power projected into the Arctic. The base was supplied by transport aircraft that flew from bases in North America. The flights were dangerous. Arctic weather could be lethal. Storms could develop suddenly. Visibility could drop to 0 in minutes. But the flights continued. Supplies flowed to Camp Century. Personnel rotated through on regular schedules. The base remained staffed and operational throughout the 1960s. What the American military didn't fully understand at the time was that the Soviets knew something was happening in Greenland. Soviet intelligence services were not omniscient, but they were sophisticated. Soviet spy satellites passed over Greenland regularly. Soviet signals intelligence intercepted radio transmissions. Soviet agents in Denmark reported unusual military activity. The Soviets could see that something significant was being built. They just couldn't figure out what. Soviet military planners theorized about Camp Century. Some believed it was a bomber base. Some believed it was a missile storage facility. Some believed it was a radar station. None of them guessed the truth, that the Americans were building an underground city beneath the ice. The Soviets responded to this threat with their own research. They increased their satellite surveillance of Greenland. They increased their signals intelligence operations. They tasked their agents in Denmark with gathering more information about what was happening in the Arctic. But they remained fundamentally mystified. The base was too well hidden. The security was too tight. The level of secrecy was too complete. Soviet intelligence could not penetrate the veil of secrecy that surrounded Camp Century. What the Soviets did know was that whatever the Americans were building in Greenland, it represented a threat. It represented American capability being projected into the Arctic. It represented American willingness to operate in hostile environments. It represented American commitment to the Cold War competition in the Arctic. The Soviet response was to increase their own Arctic military activity. The Soviets had their own bases in the Arctic. The Soviets increased their submarine activity in the waters around Greenland. The Soviets increased their air patrols. The Soviets made their presence known in the Arctic, not yet understanding that they were shadowing a secret that the Americans would soon abandon. By the late 1960s, something unexpected was happening. The ice was changing. Scientists monitoring Arctic climate patterns began noticing that temperatures were rising. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably. Year by year, decade by decade, the Arctic was getting warmer, and as the ice got warmer, it began to move differently. Ice that had been solid began to shift. Ice that had been stable began to flow. For Camp Century, this was a problem. The base had been constructed with the assumption that the ice would remain stable. The engineers had calculated based on historical ice behavior, but the ice wasn't behaving the way they expected. American military engineers began detecting structural problems in the base. The tunnels that had been carved out beneath the ice were shifting. The carefully engineered ceiling supports were being stressed. The ice walls were beginning to move. It was subtle at first, but it was unmistakable. The military commissioned a comprehensive study of Camp Century's structural integrity. What they learned was sobering. The base, which had been designed to last decades, might not be able to remain operational for much longer. The ice was degrading. The structural integrity was compromised. Eventually, the ice would become too unstable to support the installation. Military planners faced a difficult decision. They could invest enormous resources in upgrading and reinforcing the base. They could attempt to stabilize the ice. They could continue trying to maintain the facility. Or they could accept that Camp Century's days were numbered and begin the process of abandonment. By the early 1970s, the decision had been made. Camp Century would be decommissioned. The weapons would be removed. The personnel would be evacuated. The base would be sealed and left beneath the ice. The process of decommissioning was itself a military operation. The weapons were carefully removed from their storage vaults. The electronic equipment was shut down. The power plants were deactivated. Personnel who had spent months or years at the base were evacuated. By 1973, Camp Century was empty, but the base was not destroyed. The military simply sealed it. They closed the tunnel entrances. They left the infrastructure in place. They left the buildings intact. They left everything beneath the ice, expecting it to remain hidden for eternity. The assumption was that the ice would preserve Camp Century, that the cold and the pressure and the isolation would keep the secret buried. That Camp Century would remain hidden forever beneath the Arctic ice. It was an assumption that would prove dangerously wrong. In the early 2000s, climate scientists noticed something alarming. The Greenlandic ice sheet was melting faster than anyone had predicted. Summer temperatures were rising. The melt season was getting longer. The ice that had been stable for thousands of years was beginning to move and shift and retreat. Greenland was warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. Scientists called it the Arctic amplification effect. The Arctic was warming at twice the rate of the global average. The implications were staggering. If the Greenlandic ice sheet melted completely, sea levels around the world would rise by 7 meters. Coastal cities would be flooded. Islands would disappear. Entire nations would be reshaped. In response to this crisis, the scientific community launched an intensive research effort to understand what was happening to the ice. Scientists deployed thousands of instruments across Greenland. Satellites monitored ice thickness and ice movement. Ground-based equipment gathered data about ice temperature, ice flow, and ice composition. It was during this research effort, in 2013, that scientists using ground-penetrating radar detected something unusual buried beneath the ice. The radar images showed geometric structures. The structures were too regular to be natural. The structures were arranged in patterns that suggested human construction. The structures were preserved in the ice, frozen in time, waiting to be discovered. Initial analysis suggested that the structures might be a military installation. The geometric patterns matched the layout of military bases. The size suggested significant construction, but no one could identify what the structures actually were. American military officials, when contacted by the scientists, became extremely nervous. They recognized what the scientists had found. They recognized Camp Century, the base that had been buried and forgotten, the base that had been sealed beneath Arctic ice, the base that had housed nuclear weapons and military personnel decades ago. What followed was a delicate diplomatic situation. The scientists wanted to study the structures. They wanted to document them. They wanted to understand how they had been preserved, but the military wanted to keep them secret. Negotiations began between scientists and military officials. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The military would provide information about what the scientists had discovered. The scientists would maintain discretion about sensitive military details. A joint research effort would be launched to study Camp Century and to understand what this discovery meant for Arctic climate change. In 2017, the full story of Camp Century was finally revealed to the world. The military released declassified documents describing the base. The military released photographs taken during construction. The military confirmed that Camp Century had housed nuclear weapons. The military confirmed that the base had been abandoned in the early 1970s. The military confirmed that the base was now being revealed by climate change. The revelation sent shockwaves through the scientific and military communities. Camp Century had been one of the most secret installations of the Cold War. For decades, its existence had been virtually unknown outside of the military establishment. Now it was being revealed not by espionage or by military disclosure, but by climate change. Scientists rushed to study the site. Using advanced imaging technology and remote sensing equipment, researchers mapped the entire base. They documented the tunnel systems. They photographed the buildings. They recorded the dimensions and layout of the facility. They confirmed that the base had been built exactly as the declassified military documents suggested. What they discovered was remarkable. The base was still intact. The structures were still standing. The buildings were still recognizable. Decades of being frozen beneath Arctic ice had preserved Camp Century as if it had been frozen in time. The base looked almost exactly as it must have looked when it was abandoned 50 years ago. But there was a problem. The ice that had preserved Camp Century was also revealing it. And if the ice continued to melt, the base would become increasingly exposed. Eventually, the structures would emerge completely from beneath the ice. The weapons storage vaults would be visible. The infrastructure would be exposed. The question that now haunted American military planners was, what happens to a secret military base when the secret is revealed by climate change? What happens to the weapons that were stored there? What happens to the contamination that might remain? Because that was the real concern. Nuclear weapons stored in vaults for decades, diesel fuel stored in tanks, radioactive materials, toxic chemicals, all of it preserved and frozen beneath the ice, all of it about to be exposed. As scientists studied Camp Century more carefully, they began to understand the environmental implications of what had been left behind. The weapons storage vaults had been designed to keep nuclear warheads safe and functional, but they had also contained radioactive materials that could leach into the groundwater if the vaults were breached, radioactive materials that could contaminate the Arctic environment. The fuel storage tanks had contained thousands of gallons of diesel fuel that had been left behind when the base was abandoned, diesel fuel that could contaminate the ice and water if it was released, diesel fuel that could persist in the Arctic environment for decades. There were also chemical contaminants, battery acid, hydraulic fluid, lubricants, all of it used in the base's operations, all of it left behind in storage, all of it now being exposed to melting ice and changing environmental conditions. The scientific community became increasingly alarmed about the potential for environmental catastrophe. If the ice continued to melt at its current rate, the contaminants at Camp Century could be released into the Arctic ecosystem within decades. The consequences could be severe. But there was another concern, a geopolitical concern. Camp Century had not been under the jurisdiction of Greenland. It had been under American military jurisdiction, even though it was located in Greenlandic territory. Denmark, which controlled Greenland, had not been fully informed about the extent of the secret operations at Camp Century. The Greenlanders certainly had not been consulted. Now, as the existence of Camp Century became public, questions began to be asked. What right did the United States have to leave radioactive and toxic materials beneath Greenlandic ice? What were the responsibilities of the American government to clean up after Camp Century? What compensation would be provided to Greenland for the environmental risk posed by Camp Century's contamination? These questions created tension between the United States and Denmark. They created tension between the United States and Greenland. They raised complex questions about sovereignty, military responsibility, and environmental stewardship in the Arctic. The Greenlanders, for their part, were increasingly asserting their autonomy and their rights. Greenland was gradually moving toward independence from Denmark. Greenlanders wanted to know what was happening beneath their ice. They wanted to know about the weapons that had been stored there. They wanted to know about the contamination that remained. The American military was now facing a situation it had not anticipated when it built Camp Century. The secret was out. The base was being exposed. The environmental implications were becoming clear, and the political implications were becoming increasingly complex. Camp Century was not just a story about a secret military base. It was a story about something far larger. It was a story about how climate change was literally rewriting history. It was a story about how the warming Arctic was revealing secrets that had been carefully buried decades ago. The revelation of Camp Century forced governments and militaries around the world to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other military installations were hidden beneath Arctic ice? How many other secret projects had been abandoned and forgotten? How much contamination was being preserved in Arctic ice that would be released as the planet warmed? Scientific researchers began investigating. They discovered that Camp Century was not unique. There were other American military installations in the Arctic. There were Soviet military installations in the Arctic. There were military installations from other nations. All of them had been constructed in the Arctic during the Cold War. All of them had been designed to support military operations and weapons storage, and all of them were now at risk of being exposed as climate change melted Arctic ice. The revelation of Camp Century also raised questions about the future of the Arctic. For decades, the Arctic had been seen as strategically important, but practically inaccessible. The ice had made military operations difficult. The extreme cold had made any installation vulnerable to extreme environmental stress. But climate change was changing that calculation. As the ice melted, the Arctic was becoming more accessible. New shipping routes were opening up. New resources were being exposed. New military opportunities were emerging. Governments around the world began recognizing that the Arctic would be strategically important in the coming decades in ways it had never been before. Russia increased its military presence in the Arctic. The United States increased its focus on Arctic capabilities. Canada asserted its sovereignty in Arctic waters. Norway, Denmark, and Greenland grappled with the implications of Arctic change. The Arctic, which had been one of the most remote and isolated regions of Earth, was suddenly becoming a focus of intense geopolitical competition. Camp Century stood as a symbol of this transformation. It was a relic of the Cold War, a secret military base designed to support nuclear deterrence during an existential competition between superpowers. But it was also a harbinger of the future. It was a sign that the Arctic was changing. It was a sign that secrets buried beneath ice would not remain buried forever. It was a sign that the warming planet was forcing humanity to confront its past, while desperately trying to imagine its future. As of today, Camp Century remains largely in place. The American military has begun assessing what needs to be done about the contamination left behind. The Greenlandic government has begun asserting its rights regarding what happens at the site. International negotiations are ongoing about responsibility, remediation, and environmental protection. But the fundamental uncertainty remains. No one knows exactly what will happen as the ice continues to melt. No one knows how quickly the base will be exposed. No one knows what environmental consequences will result from the release of radioactive and toxic materials that have been preserved in Arctic ice. What is certain is that climate change is forcing us to reckon with our past. Camp Century represents a decision made decades ago by American military strategists who believed that the Arctic ice would preserve their secret indefinitely. They were wrong. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is preserved forever. Everything hidden eventually emerges. The revelation of Camp Century also represents a lesson about the limits of military secrecy in an age of advanced technology and climate change. Satellites can see what humans thought was hidden. Radar can penetrate beneath ice. Scientific research can reveal military secrets. And climate change can do in decades what military camouflage tried to prevent. Expose the truth that was buried beneath layers of ice and secrecy. For the Greenlanders and for Danes living in Greenland, the revelation of Camp Century represented a kind of betrayal. The base had been constructed on their territory. Weapons of mass destruction had been stored beneath their ice. Potentially dangerous contaminants had been left behind, and they had never been told. The military had kept it secret from the civilian population. The government had kept it hidden from the public. As information about Camp Century became more widely known, it sparked a national conversation in Greenland about autonomy, sovereignty, and independence. Greenlanders began asking why they should remain part of Denmark if decisions about their future were being made in Washington or Copenhagen without their input or knowledge. The Camp Century revelation became part of the broader movement toward Greenlandic independence. It became a symbol of how Greenland had been treated as a pawn in the geopolitical games of larger powers, without having any voice in the decision-making process. It became a rallying point for those who believed that Greenland deserved to control its own destiny. American military officials, confronted with the revelation of Camp Century and its implications, began to understand that the Arctic was not an empty wilderness where military operations could be conducted in secret. The Arctic was inhabited. There were people living there. There were nations with sovereignty claims. There were governments that had legitimate interests in what happened on their territory. The era of conducting covert military operations in the Arctic, without the knowledge or consent of the people living there, was coming to an end. Climate change was forcing a reckoning. It was forcing military establishments to engage with civilian populations. It was forcing governments to negotiate rather than simply impose their will. Camp Century tells a story that extends far beyond the Cold War. It tells a story about climate change and about how the warming Arctic is literally rewriting the geography and geology of Earth. The ice that preserved Camp Century for 50 years is the same ice that is now disappearing. Scientists estimate that if current warming trends continue, most of the Greenlandic ice sheet will be gone within the next century. Glaciers that have existed for thousands of years will disappear within decades. The Arctic will be transformed into an environment barely recognizable compared to what it looks like today. Camp Century is just one of the casualties of this transformation. As the ice melts, hundreds of other sites will be exposed. Archaeological sites will be revealed. Historical artifacts will emerge. Military installations will be exposed. The secrets that were buried beneath ice will come to light. This revelation process is already beginning. Archaeologists in Greenland are rushing to study sites that were inaccessible just a decade ago, but are now becoming visible as the ice retreats. Researchers are discovering the remains of medieval Norse settlements. They are finding artifacts from Inuit cultures. They are mapping human history that has been hidden beneath ice, but they are also discovering environmental catastrophe. As the ice melts, it is revealing contamination from decades of human activity. Oil spills from Arctic exploration, heavy metals from industrial operations, radioactive materials from military installations. The Arctic is becoming an archaeological dig site, not just for human history, but for the history of environmental degradation. The story of Camp Century is ultimately a story about the consequences of our choices and the limits of our ability to control nature. American military planners chose to build a secret base beneath Arctic ice. They believed that ice would preserve their secret indefinitely. They believed that the Arctic would remain frozen. They believed that their decisions would not have to be reckoned with by future generations. They were wrong on all counts. Climate change has done what no amount of military security could do. It has revealed the secret. It has exposed the base. It has forced a reckoning with the contamination left behind. And it has raised profound questions about military responsibility, environmental stewardship, and our relationship with the Arctic. The revelation of Camp Century is a warning about the future. It is a warning that secrets buried beneath ice will not remain buried forever. It is a warning that decisions made in the name of military security have environmental consequences that cannot be escaped. It is a warning that as the planet warms and the ice melts, many more secrets will emerge. The Arctic is changing. The ice is melting. The secrets are being revealed. Camp Century was just the beginning. In the coming decades, as the ice continues its dramatic retreat, more will emerge from beneath the frozen surface. More military installations will be exposed. More contamination will be released. More conflicts over Arctic sovereignty and responsibility will emerge. Camp Century stands as a monument to an era when the Arctic seemed infinite and unchanging. But that era is ending. The Arctic is transforming. And humanity is being forced to confront the consequences of decisions made decades ago in an Arctic that no longer exists. This is the story of Camp Century. This is the story of how climate change is rewriting history. This is the story of secrets buried beneath ice that time and warming temperatures have forced into the light.